Thank you for that very generous introduction. It's a pleasure to be here, as it always is. I've come to Zurich many times over the years because it's such an intellectually stimulating place, and every time I come here, including this time already, I've learned a lot in conversations with the faculty. So I'm very excited to be here again. Let me tell you what I'd like to discuss today. I'll move over here so I can see my notes a bit better. I'd like to discuss the role of innovation in promoting global health and fighting poverty. And, Ernst, I think very appropriately, stressed the role of randomized trials and the experimental method in contributing to science and also in contributing to policy advice. I'm going to suggest that randomized trials and experimental method can actually be useful in something that, as was pointed out, many of you all here are really experts in, which is innovation. So let me be a little bit. Let me give you an outline in a little bit more detail of what I'd like to say. Oh, okay. Sorry. Sorry, I'm having a bit of trouble. Sorry. Thanks.
Good Swiss tradition, I switched it off to save energy. But now it should work.
Great. So. Thank you so much. Great. Wonderful. So let me say a little bit about what I mean by innovation. I think when people hear about innovation, they often think of particular new products embodying new technology. Something on our mind these days is vaccines against COVID, for example. Obviously, that's a very important type of innovation, but I'm going to also have in mind a broader definition of innovation that could include new policy approaches or new business processes. So an example of a policy approach would be something that Mexico introduced, which was replacing a tangle of complicated social welfare programs with conditional cash transfers if the families have their kids in school and are providing basic health care to them. But let me also mention another type, which is new business processes. And the study of Lorenzo's that you just heard is a great example of how innovations in business can not only help the firms, but can actually also lead to huge gains for the customer, for their customers, for their workers, and in this case, for their suppliers. So it'll be a broad definition of innovation. Let me note also that I'm thinking not just of the individual innovations, like the example that, of the insurance contract, but also of meta-innovations. So if we think about the case of health, there's a whole set of innovations that then enabled further innovations. So if we go way back, microscopes, the germ theory of disease, randomized trials themselves have enabled lots of progress on many different pharmaceuticals and beyond that. Another category of what I'll call meta-innovations that ease the way for further innovations are new systems for incentivizing and shaping innovation. So, it may seem natural to us, well, of course we have intellectual property, of course we have patents, but of course there was a time when that wasn't part of the system. And the intellectual property rights system has developed and changed over time in response to changing social needs. There are many other examples as well. The peer review system for allocating research funding. That's something that I don't know if people know this, but there was actually a relative of the former U.S. President Bush, an ancestor, who was very distinguished and helped develop this system of the peer review system in World War II for allocating research funding. And I think that's had a huge impact over time. Now, we know that innovation drives economic growth. I think it can also, we also know the incredible impacts on health. I think we can, one thing that innovation can also do is it can address some of the problems of the poorest people in the world, whether that's health problems, whether that's need for insurance, whether that's environmental problems. But the speed of innovation, the direction of innovation, depends very much on social institutions. And the market provides strong incentives for some types of innovation, but there are other types of innovation that are also very important, where sometimes the market incentives are currently too weak. And that's a case where policy can come in to strengthen that. Okay. So let me the outline for the talk. First, I'm going to talk some about the experimental method in development economics and adaptation of the approach used in medicine, and talk about how that can be a tool for innovation. But you've already heard a great example. I'll give one other example of water treatment. And then I'll talk about institutions for innovation, to try to move this from individual studies to things that can have a much larger impact. And there I'll put on another hat, which is I'm involved in a program in the US government called Development Innovation Ventures, which helps support innovative new approaches to problems of development. And we'll just try to take a look at what's the social rate of return on our investments. I'll share that, and then I'll talk a little bit about the huge contemporary issue in the world, which is vaccines, and how do we try to improve institutions for developing vaccines. Okay. So if you think about the traditional image of economists, what at least I would have thought, well, sometimes we write models with lots of Greek letters in them, sometimes we analyze data, but we don't necessarily, and there are obviously very important exceptions, have deep knowledge of the context that we're necessarily investigating. We get a data set from somebody else and we do statistics on it, but that's maybe not the same as if you're studying education, actually having worked in the classroom as a teacher, for example. Another aspect of traditional concept of economics is we might be involved in evaluating policies, but not necessarily in developing new approaches. And I don't think either of those stereotypes of economics is completely true, and I think they're less and less true over time. But I think there is some grain of truth, particularly if you compare this to other fields. So for example, if you think about medicine or biochemistry or computer science, it's taken as given that people who are graduate students in computer science will go out and found companies, and some of them very successful, obviously. Or that people who are researchers in biology or biochemistry will sometimes go on to form biotech firms, or will, that hasn't been the image in economics. Now, in contrast, what's behind this? Well, or what are some of the features of this in these other fields? Well, one is that sometimes, and ideally, there's a close connection between the frontier research in the field and the practical innovation. And ideally, that's something that's mutually reinforcing. New fundamental scientific insights come out of attempts to address specific practical challenges. Another feature is many of these fields use some sort of randomized trials. You've heard about the case of medicine, that's obvious, but even in tech firms, there are often many A/B tests as well. Google or Facebook, they're running A/B tests all the time. And a key feature of those is to try to understand the causal effect of a new medical treatment or of a tweak to the design of Amazon's platform, for example. Now, what Abhijit, Esther, and I received the Nobel Prize for was in some ways, it's a little crazy that we got it because, we're just taking this idea from that was already well established in medicine, and there were some cases in economics, and trying to apply it to the field of development economics. And certainly when I was involved in initial studies in development economics on this, I thought of this as something to isolate the causal effects of particular policies and separate those from all sorts of other confounding factors. If you're studying, a lot of my early work was in education, there's all sorts of things that are affecting students' test scores other than the particular policy we were looking at of additional textbooks, for example. So having a large enough sample and doing a randomized controlled trial gives a way of isolating that, just as it does in pharmaceuticals, or at least if ideally it does, if done well. But I think that was actually, in retrospect, I feel like that wasn't necessarily the only, or maybe even not necessarily the most important aspect of the experimental approach. I think another important aspect is that it's typically based on ongoing collaboration between researchers and practitioners. Researchers are not going to, let me take Lorenzo's study, for example. This was not something that he could do by himself. He was working with a very large sugar company, and the sugar company, if you're offering these contracts where you get a little bit less for your sugar, but in return you get the insurance, well, that's something that the insurance company has to decide to implement. And that means you have to address a whole bunch of practical details that have to be done in a way that works for the business. And similarly, if you're working with the government, it has to work for the government, or if it's an NGO, it has to work for the NGO. Now, initially, and sometimes we see that as a disadvantage. Oh, it's so complicated to work with these partners. Well, I would argue it's actually an advantage, because we get all sorts of insights that we might not have from our abstract models and from our ways of thinking within the discipline by being forced. And sometimes this is about being forced. I hope it's that's less and less so, to work with practitioners. A second aspect is it's inherently interdisciplinary. If you're working on education, you need education specialists. If you're working on health, you need to work with health specialists. A third aspect, and I think this is tied to working on practical problems, is that it's iterative. It's not a matter of one experiment and then you have the answer and you go home. No, you have to continually refine things. There's a first approach, and again, I think for people in business this is obvious, but I think it wasn't necessarily obvious within the academic world. Or if people thought of iteration, it was over a much longer time scale. You can iterate much more rapidly with experiments. And I think all of that means that the experimental method is not just a useful tool for scientific understanding. And don't get me wrong, I'm very excited about scientific understanding. I don't mean to minimize that at all. Or policy evaluation, I think that's also very important. But it can also be a tool for innovation. Because if you think about this example, Lorenzo, this was an idea that this was not just Lorenzo saying, hey, the government or a large insurance company is trying out this idea, and I'm going to evaluate it. No, Lorenzo helped develop that idea, and he developed that idea in part based on his knowledge of what was going on in economics, and in particular what was going on in behavioral economics, one of the great strengths of Zurich and of Ernst. So that's an example of scientific understanding feeding into innovation. But equally, I think that paper feeds back into scientific understanding. Okay, let me give an example. I'll try to, I wanted this for concreteness, but it's great that you heard about the insurance example. So this is a health example. Diarrhea is a leading cause of child mortality in low-income countries. It's often waterborne. There are over 2 billion people who are drinking water that is contaminated with fecal material. Now, we tried various approaches to addressing this. One called spring protection. I won't go into too much detail on that. But one of the issues there was the water got recontaminated. It got cleaned up at the source, a naturally occurring spring, but it got recontaminated. So we thought about water treatment. And what you see is a bottle of a water treatment solution that's sold commercially in Kenya, sort of socially marketed. But there's very low take-up, just similar to what you heard in the insurance case. Only about 7% of people buy this. Chlorine's super cheap. This is about, I have not translated this into francs, but about 30 US cents for a bottle that would serve for a family for a month. And actually, most of that cost is the packaging. It's not actually the marketing and so on. It's not the chlorine. If you buy a bottle of bleach, that has enough chlorine in it to treat 100,000 liters of water, I believe, 70 to 100,000. Okay. So that approach wasn't working. Well, what did we try? We went through a variety of this was a long process. I'll skip over that. But let me tell you what we wound up with, or one of the things we wound up with was point of collection dispensers. At those springs where people are collecting the water, there's a container, a bigger container, full of that same water treatment solution. And this was designed using principles from behavioral science and behavioral economics. So you can see that it's fairly salient. It's not like you get home from collecting water, the kids are crying, somewhere in the house you've got this small bottle. No, when you go to collect the water, this big bright blue thing that's announcing its presence to you. It's very convenient to use. It's right at the water container. You turn the tap and the right dosage comes out for a water container. It's free. This is actually also a consistent finding. For preventive health, there's often very low take-up, and making it free in the case of things that are involved in communicable disease and that are very low cost can be an effective approach. It's also designed so that people can build a habit. There's a particular time that's a natural time to treat it. It's, again, you get home, kids are crying, husband wants something. You might put off treating the water, but this you do when you're collecting the water, and you have to do it then or not otherwise. So that helps form a habit the same way that you brush your teeth in the morning, and that makes things easier to do. It's also public. So if you have questions about this, you can ask other people, because this is a water collection point the whole community uses. Okay. So we iterated on this. What we estimate in the end, this increased take up to around 50%, and this was sustained over time. It wasn't sort of a one-off after a big campaign. We estimate the cost effectiveness that this costs, about $70 to save a year of life, or about $2,100 per life saved, with discounting the way the WHO recommends. Now, we iterated on this multiple times. We worked with an NGO. That NGO is now serving 2 million people across several countries in East Africa. Let me skip over this other approach, water treatment coupons. I forgot to put on my timer, so feel free to tell me when I'm going on too long. So let me skip over the point's been made. Many researchers are now using this approach. It's very common. This department is one leading place, but there are many. Okay. So let me move from the perspective of the experimental method and individual studies and say a bit about institutions for innovation. And let me start with investing in innovation. So there are many recent initiatives in the global community over the past 20 years or so to promote innovation in international development. And some of that we're familiar with, which is sort of basic scientific research and development. The Gates Foundation investing in new vaccines or new types of seeds. That's been studied for a long time, and it's pretty well established that there's phenomenal rates of return to that, not specifically in international development context, but just in general, very high rates of return to this type of scientific research. Rates of return of 60 to 70%, not necessarily to the individual company, but to society as a whole. But a lot of the new work is of two other types. One is social science research of the type we've been discussing today. Another one is the impact investing, the social entrepreneurship movement, things that you would think that the Omidyar Network or the Skoll Foundation would support. Now those, we don't have those types of estimates of what's the rate of return. So, Ernst and I have just told you two stories of successes. Yeah, there are a lot of failures as well, let me be honest with you. So is it, does this make sense or does this not make sense? So we tried, and this is, at some level very crude. It's not as nice as a randomized controlled trial. But I wanted to share some results. So I'm involved with one of these efforts. U.S. Agency for International Development set up something that's a part of the U.S. government, set up something called Development Innovation Ventures. And I was involved in setting that up, and I'm continue to be scientific director. So we decided, so it might be biased, so I should disclose that. But we tried to look at what's the track record of the innovations we supported in terms of the rate of return for society as a whole. And in particular, we tried to ask two questions from our very early portfolio. It takes time for innovations to scale, often decades. But within 10 years, what was the rate of return? And then, is there any evidence on which types of innovations scale? So, in an academic seminar, I put a long list of caveats, but I'll skip over them. Happy to come to them in Q&A. Let me say a little bit about how the Innovation Fund works. In some ways, this is a little bit of a cross between venture capital and academic funding. We're open across sectors. We're very open across whether it's a particular gadget or technology or it's a new business method, or whether it's going to be something implemented by governments or something scaled commercially by private firms. So how do you maintain any standards, any rigor if you're open in so many ways? Well, we try to have tiered funding based on evidence. So the first stage, we actually don't ask for a lot of evidence. That's just for piloting a new idea. We want to take gambles on that, and we'll take, certainly back at the time we started, and that's when the data's from, we were pretty open. We didn't have exhaustive requirements. The government said that they'll do this if it succeeds, or that there was a track record of success of the management team. Second stage the first stage was just up to $100,000 at the time. Second stage was up to $1 million, and there we wanted rigorous testing, either of the randomized controlled trial type that you've heard me discuss and heard a description of Lorenzo's work, or if this is a business model, that this is actually going to cover its costs. Third stage was for things that were proved successful earlier, and to help them transition to scale. So here's the pattern, and I think this is the pattern that you expect in any type of innovation funding. This is not what we ultimately care about, which is the social return, but it's an intermediate step. This is the number of beneficiaries reached. So we looked at 41 different innovations we supported in our first couple of years. And this is the number of people they reached. And what you can see is most of these innovations did not reach that many people. So if you want to sort of, find examples of failure, there are plenty of them. But then there were 9 of these innovations that reached over 1 million people. Now, and that's, quite high by the standards of the social investing world. Now, we wanted to quantify the benefits. Well, some of these things, we couldn't quantify the benefits because we couldn't put a dollar value on it. Things like the voter report cards or ways to reduce voter fraud. No idea how to put a dollar value on that. For some that produced economic outputs or ones that produced health outputs where they're established methodologies, and where the data was available, we were able to do that. Those are the ones in red. Okay, I'm not going to go through all of these. Let me just give you one example. This is work by James Habirimana and Billy Jack. So in East Africa, many parts of many low-income and middle-income countries, there are lots of minibuses. They drive like crazy. Some of you may be familiar with them. They're very dangerous. They kill a lot of people. Now, certainly when I'm a passenger in those, I'm not now. I'm moved up in the world, I guess. But when I was a grad student and a junior faculty member, and I was a passenger in these, I sometimes wanted to say slow down. But you felt awkward doing that. You didn't want to. I thought maybe that was just me as a foreigner. Well, they had the idea. James is originally from East Africa. They had the idea. Well, maybe we just need to empower the passengers to speak up. And they had the idea of putting a sticker inside the minibus saying, if you're feeling, tell the driver to slow down if you're uncomfortable. Well, that means not only does it tell people they can do it, it also makes it socially permissible because everybody knows that everybody else knows that you can ask, and the drivers know that. And they found, and here they used insurance company data, that there was a 25% reduction in accidents, a truly incredible reduction in accidents. Well, afterwards, this was scaled up, partly by the largest insurance company in Kenya, which made it a condition of coverage, and partly by the government of Kenya, which said when you want your license renewed, you have to get this. Okay, how do we put a dollar value? And I'm going to skip over the dollar value of life, but we sort of use very philosophically fraught area, but we used fairly standard methods and we're conservative. Now, we only put in part of the funding for this, so we only count part of the benefits, but this looks like one of the investments that yielded a high return. Okay, so you can do that for individual investments, but of course, we can only do that. We couldn't do that for everything. We didn't have the data. In some cases, we had no way of putting a dollar value on it. So here's the approach we did, was we said, let's look at the cost of the portfolio. So the full portfolio of innovations, including some admin costs. And then let's look at the benefits of just 5 of these innovations, where we could get the data. And of course, since it's a skewed distribution, if you pick 5 of the top 10, you're probably getting a reasonable fraction of the total. The ratio that we found was 17 to 1. 17 times as many benefits as the money that was put in. Now look, I'm not going to, would I swear on that 17 number? No. But what I think, and in a lot of ways, it's likely an underestimate. What I would say is, I think this is, and I'm going to skip over this. We also saw what the correlates were. It has to be really cheap. It's much more likely to scale if it's cheap. A lot of these social entrepreneurs thought they were going to sell directly to consumers. Again, for a business audience, a lot of business is business to business or business to government. That reduces customer acquisition costs. And with a really cheap product, that's pretty important. So those were more likely to scale. The right-hand side, we funded a lot of sort of straight social entrepreneurship things. And some of them were very big successes. Sometimes there's a view that sort of involving researchers is going to slow things down, that they're going to get in the way. What we found was that where there was a randomized controlled trial, or where development economics researchers were involved, and these things are very correlated with each other, so you can't really separate out the effect, they were actually much more likely to scale to 1 million users. And I think what I would take away from that is that, while the image of economists as, ivory tower and absorbed in their theories, disconnected from the real world, there's, I think there's many types of economists now. Some are doing, very good, very theoretical work, and I think that contributes to what the rest of us do. But many of us are now not only trying to get involved with the real world, not only learning about things in the real world, but actually getting involved in developing innovations, just like medical researchers, just like computer scientists. And I think that's a very exciting development. I'm going to I think there's room for this in not just in study of poverty, but there's a. Sorry, I'll say a little bit more about this conclusion slide. I think you want to judge this on the portfolio basis, not just thinking about individual projects. And because the distribution is so skewed, you want to take some risks. And you have to be willing to do that. I think that the high benefit cost ratio suggests that there's room for more of these social innovation funds. France has just set up, which Esther Duflo is playing a key role in, a very similar fund. I think there's room for lots more of these. I'm an economist who focuses on the problems of low and middle income countries, but there are many social challenges the world is facing. And I think there's room for these in other areas. One that I think is obvious is environmental sustainability. But there are many challenges in education, a host of other areas. I had some material on COVID and other types of other institutions for innovation. Happy to discuss that in Q&A, but I think maybe I should end the formal presentation here.
Many thanks indeed, ladies and gentlemen. Nobel laureate, please stay here. I'll join you to your left. Many thanks indeed, Professor Kremer. Highly interesting stuff. As I've never before been on stage with a Nobel laureate, may I please ask you a terribly silly question? Just one. Okay. Cross my heart, hope to die. Just one silly question of mine, and then you get the clever questions of these clever people. Right. So, very kind of you. If I were to win a Nobel Prize, and of course everyone, each and everyone in here and the audience on their screens do know this is never ever going to happen, but just for argument's sake, if I were to win a Nobel Prize medal, I would take it with me all the time. As a lucky charm, as a reassurance, and basically and mainly to show off with it. Where is your Nobel medal?
Well, if I tried that approach, I would have lost it very, very quickly.
So you keep it safe.
I tried to bring it back and brought it in a bag to my bank and to put it. Got a safety deposit box for the first time and opened up my bag and I thought it wasn't there. But somewhere deeper in the bag, it had fallen out of the box that it was supposed to be in, but was still in the bag. So it's in a safety deposit box in a bank that will remain undisclosed. So
you ever after that, after putting it into the safety deposit box, you ever took it out to look at it once more?
I haven't done that, but you can buy a duplicate copy that I sent to my father. So
that's the first time I hear that. Thank you. You carried my silly question.
Well, the best thing is they've got chocolate versions that you can that are at all the tables that you can eat. So that was one of the highlights. So.
Oh, I see. Ladies and gentlemen, your chance to get your own Nobel Prize medal, get a chocolate one. So here we go. Well, there are some people in here who actually are prone to get a real one, but we're not mentioning names in here. So many thanks for parrying off my silly question. And now, ladies and gentlemen, of course, to the informed, to, as I said, smart and clever questions, to your questions. Do allow me to remind the audience following the live stream once more of the Mentimeter code, which probably will be seen on your screens right now for the time being. Go to the Mentimeter website, give in the password, give in the code, and there you go. Your questions then will land right here on my bulky tablet, and then I will ask Michael Kremer on your behalf these clever questions. Now let's see what's come in so far via Mentimeter. And actually there is the possibility to upvote questions, and there's one that seems to be the leader. So I think we go ahead and shoot. Illness causes poverty, and poverty causes illness. Classic development. Aid has many approaches, but where should we really start first to get out of this spiral, this vicious circle?
So I think I completely agree with that statement that illness causes poverty, poverty causes illness. Where do you start? I think that sometimes people tend to think, oh, the solution is education, or the solution is health, or the solution is better financial systems so people can start their own businesses. My view is, in some ways, you could say this is a boring one, but is that within each of these areas, whether it's health, whether it's education, whether it's finance, there are approaches that don't work, and there are approaches that do work. And you heard about, to come back to this insurance example, been a lot of efforts to try to sell insurance to farmers. Most of them haven't worked. Well, Lorenzo helped develop a new approach that does work. And I think the same thing is true in many other areas. I talked about that for water treatment. Let me just come to one example, which I've been involved in, which I think brings home your initial claim. And, let me also be a little bit clear. While I agree that illness contributes to poverty, that's not an article of faith. That's not, I think that there were a lot of people who were skeptical about that. And there's a bunch of research that, played a role in demonstrating that. But let me mention that one project that I was involved in. So many people, historically in high-income countries like the US or Japan or Italy, were infected, or UK, were infected with worms. Hookworm, whipworm, roundworm. And they're still very common in low-income and to some extent middle-income countries. So, billions of people are exposed to these worms. And these worms don't typically kill you. And they're not, you hear about malaria, HIV, TB, COVID. Worms don't make that type of list. And, maybe justifiably. But they're very cheap to treat. And they're very safe to treat. And so if you're thinking about pets, there's a huge industry of selling worms for domestic pets, dogs and so on. There's a huge industry of supplying medicine against worms. I don't know, I said it for dogs, it's medicine against worms. But for livestock, these are used in agriculture. But meanwhile, there are millions of people who have worms and who are not getting this very inexpensive medicine, 2 cents per dose for some of this. Well, what the World Health Organization has been advocating for some time is in areas, it's very expensive and difficult to test to see if somebody has worms, but it's very cheap to treat. And there are parts of the world where 90% of the population has worms. So they're suggesting that just in those areas, that school kids who are particularly likely to have worms be automatically treated for the worms, so they can opt out if they want. So we evaluated a program like that. And in the short run, we saw people were less likely to drop out of school, and that was enough for us to say, hey, this looks like a great program. But we followed this over the years. And we've now followed for 20 years. And what we're finding is that this treatment for worms is increasing incomes by about 13 to 14%. So this is something that is costs 2 cents, maybe 50 cents with delivery costs, and is increasing somebody's income, for the 20 years that we've been studying it by 13 or 14%. Yeah, that's an incredible rate of return on investment.
So basically, you don't bother to diagnose anymore. You just treat a whole population in a certain area, and you get the same result, even if you don't have worms. It won't do you any harm.
It won't do you any harm, right?
Right, here we go. I'm very glad you didn't, comment on the medication on worms in horses, I think.
Oh,
but let's not go there. Let's not go there.
It's the same stuff. I endorse it if you've got worms or if you're, but I won't.
But it doesn't help against COVID, does it?
big as fan as I am, I'm not going to endorse it against COVID.
Excellent, excellent. Ladies and gentlemen, of course, you can ask here in this room, you can ask questions as well. We've got two very kind assistants with microphones in their hands. So it's very simple. We do it old school. If you have questions, please raise your hand, and a microphone will be getting to you in a jiffy. Any questions? Who's daring to make a start? It is not every day you get Michael Kremer to ask questions to, so please go ahead, shoot. Otherwise, we go on with there we go, to my left, and the microphone, it's right on your way.
Hi, Michael. My name is Stefan German from Fondation Bodnar. Our foundation operates mainly in very complex urban environments in low and middle income countries, and we find that the sort of approach of randomized controlled trials within highly complex environments is very challenging in terms of contribution and attribution. So how do you apply that approach in complex urban environments?
Right. I think, going from this idea to figuring out how to apply it there was a lot of work needed to be done for that. And I think, Esther and Abhijit and I did some of that, but there's been a huge amount of work done by others. So one of my current colleagues at Chicago, Chris Blattman, has some really fascinating research that was done in West Africa on cognitive behavioral therapy. And some basic this is maybe more of a post-conflict situation, so maybe a little bit easier, but still plenty of conflict. And they saw a reduction, they saw big improvements from very simple cognitive behavioral therapy inspired approaches. There are other, that was actually then tried in Chicago, which has a lot of crime, and similar approaches were found to be effective there. There are other examples of looking at the impact of truth and reconciliation efforts. There's work ongoing now on trying to establish opportunities for, one thing that we see in the Bible and we see currently now is conflict between herders and farmers. And, this is big where not now, but it was historically big in Kansas where I grew up. And they're looking at having meetings between, regular meetings between different groups to discuss the issues. I don't think there are results from that one yet, but I think there are a bunch of innovations to try to reduce violence, some of which have had remarkable results that have been tested. But I don't think. Just to be clear, I don't think that you can always do a randomized controlled trial, that it's the only valid technique. Sometimes it's just impossible. Sometimes you have to go with the best information you have, and that's totally appropriate.
Thank you very much. Any more questions? Right to my right. We changed the side of the room. Microphone on its way.
Thank you. Alex Bakari, Council on Economic Policies. Thanks very much for a fascinating speech. Can your approach of using trials to find out what the better approach is also be taken to a macro level? I think the examples that you shared show us ways on a microeconomic level. Can it, I wouldn't know how, but I'd be curious if it can be used to find out better tax policies, better monetary policies, better trade policies.
Right. Well, let me, we've talked some about Lorenzo's work. So another great researcher here, Dina Pomerantz, looks at tax issues. And look, I don't want to, there's certainly some issues that are too macro. Central bank independence, I don't think we can ever examine that with randomized trials. But Dina, the theory of value-added taxes is that you can build in cross-checks. And that can potentially be a way to greatly improve revenue collection. And Dina has looked at the effect of some interventions in VAT systems to try to increase compliance, and found that there are impacts. And ongoing work in that area is finding when there can be spillovers onto other firms. So that's an example for tax policy. Here's another way that you can get at some macro questions. with randomized controlled trials, even if they're fairly local. So one approach I mentioned was conditional cash transfers that Mexico pioneered, and have now been adopted by scores of countries. Another approach that's got a lot of interest right now is just giving out cash, sort of the basic income approach in a way, or just cash transfers. One approach that's been done by some NGOs is just giving people fairly large sums of money in a village. What they found was, so there was a study on this that suggested that the gains were much larger than and this is, maybe you want to wait for more evidence on this, but I think it's very intriguing. The gains to the village were much greater, and they spilled over beyond the people who got the cash to the village as a whole. And the idea is that this, in maybe a Keynesian type way, stimulated the economy in the village as a whole. So that sheds light on macro issues, even though it's not very monetary policy or something like that.
Thank you. Any more questions right here? Otherwise, there's one to my left. I think we take one, and then we have another look at the Mentimeter questions. Go ahead, shoot.
Hello. My name is Beatrix, local market leader of a consulting company. So my question is, one of the big challenges today is how to get people to get their COVID vaccination. Right. So I wonder why this field research hasn't been used yet to understand what motivates people most to get the vaccination, or it has been done, but I don't know the results.
Right. So some research on that topic is ongoing. In fact, Esther and Abhijit and others, the long list of co-authors, have a study of telephone messages to people, and they find some impact of that. I agree it's a very ripe area for research. The work that I've done has been more on the supply of vaccines, and while that issue and how to design contracts to encourage large-scale supply. And I think this is an area where, again, the social value of getting large-scale supply greatly exceeds the commercial value to the pharmaceutical firms by multiple orders of magnitude. So while in the US, or I assume in Switzerland, supply is no longer the constraint, in many low-income countries, it remains the constraint. And trying to get more production of vaccines is really key. Part of what we advocated was to have advanced contracts. So the standard way of incentivizing research is through intellectual property rights, which is great at incentivizing research, but it does so by promising a monopoly. And that can sometimes reduce access to the and particularly in the case of pandemic, that is real, can have real consequences, and therefore comes under political attack. So one thing that I've been involved in is trying to come up with new ways of incentivizing research that don't get rid of intellectual property, but rather build on it. And in particular, the idea has been to issue contracts in advance to say to commit that to reward the firms for building the large-scale capacity early, even before whether they knew the vaccines would work. It's very expensive to build a vaccine factory, as maybe some people here know. So firms would normally wait for the results of a test. For COVID, it made sense from a social point of view for governments to offer to pay for that in advance on the chance that it would work, and for governments to take on that risk. And that was the approach that the US used in Operation Warp Speed, that the UK used. We calculate that if that advanced the development of a vaccine by 12 hours, it would have paid for itself. So I think that's another example of of a meta-innovation, of how innovating in the ways we encourage research can have enormous social payoffs. Now, the issue was, unfortunately, that wasn't done on a wide enough scale, and we're still short of vaccines for low-income countries.
Indeed, we are. I think, coming to a close, I've got here one Mentimeter question, I think, which is first quite brilliant, and second, very apt to coming to a close. This is Q&A. There is some criticism that we should not push our beliefs, e.g. interventions, onto the poor. What is your take about this ethical dilemma?
So I think so first, all of these types of studies have to be approved both by the local authorities in the country, and if they're done by a researcher from outside the country, by their home institution through human subjects committees. But this was a question about pushing the ideas, and there, I think, as my general view is that as researchers we can try to test new ideas, but ultimately we're not the decision makers and shouldn't be the decision makers. If this is a matter of, let's say, Mexico, and this was a case where the government, probably the most successful innovation in terms of widespread adoption of anything. This was developed by the government of Mexico. They tried this approach. They found it successful. They decided to scale it up. And then many other countries, initially in Latin America, now all over the world, have done similar things. That's a decision that should be made by the governments involved. Obviously, if this is something for an idea for a business, the business will have to decide. If it's for an NGO, the NGO will have to decide, but with the participation of the country where they're working.
Ladies and gentlemen, Nobel laureate Michael Kremer, thank you so much for your time. Many thanks indeed.
It was a pleasure.
For taking your time, answering all those questions. Many thanks indeed for being here with us. I take it you stay a little bit longer, mingle with the audience, with the upcoming apéro, drinks and little snacks. So
yes.
You're going to stay. There you go. Go and grab them. Many thanks, Michael Kremer.
Thank
Pleasure
you.
talking to you. Thank you.
Thank you.